For Peter, James, and John, this was quite literally the quintessential mountaintop experience. Imagine how it must have all played out from their perspective. We read it as the narrator tells us, but imagine what it must have been like for them. It was just the three of them. They'd been traveling with Jesus for over 2 years with this large crowd of at least 12, but often there was a larger entourage with them. But this one particular day, Jesus says to just the three of them, let's go up to the mountain to pray. Imagine yourself in those shoes. They have just been tapped by Jesus, their teacher, to be the only three to go with him. They would have felt pretty cool about that. Imagine what you would feel. You would feel very special. Then, when they make it to the mountaintop, in a scene that must have brought Moses to their minds, they find themselves first there in the presence of Jesus, who's been transformed physically, transfigured. His face shining so bright, his clothes turned to dazzling white. And then there before them, two men that they recognize to be Elijah and Moses, and all of that. And then the shrouded cloud, they hear the voice of God. If there was any lingering doubts about who Jesus was or how important he was, they must have certainly been gone. For truly, Peter and James and John, this must have been an awe-inspiring, awesome, breathtaking moment. Not only did they see their teacher glorified by God in the changing of his appearance, but also the appearance of the prophets that lifted them in their eyes to see Jesus on that prophetic level with Moses and Elijah. Let's unpack that for a moment. Remember, Moses and Elijah were considered heavenly beings themselves. Elijah, they knew, had not died here on earth, but was instead carried away in a chariot of fire, as witnessed by his disciple Elisha. In some Jewish traditions, it was believed, mostly because they do not know where he died or where his grave is, that Moses himself was taken into heaven without suffering death. All of that must have been confirmed right here on the mountaintop as they saw them appear to Jesus. And then they must have wondered if they, like Elisha, would have the privilege of watching Jesus taken into heaven. Now, it sounds foolish to us, yes, because we know what they didn't know about what was going to happen in Jerusalem. But these men had already witnessed a great many wondrous miracles. They had heard the words of this man who was truly filled with the Spirit and the power of God. Peter himself, just before this, had recognized Jesus and proclaimed him to be the Son of God. But still, until this point, they might have still had some doubt. But now, no longer. How could they doubt anything? They had just witnessed the ultimate verification of Jesus' position as a prophet, as Messiah, as the Son of God. And so, of course, when it all begins to happen, it's Peter who speaks first, true to form, because Peter's always getting his mouth ahead of his brain, which, that's why we love Peter, because oftentimes we look so good next to Peter. Peter's the one who speaks, suggesting that they build 3 booths. Now, the word for booth is the same word that they use when they're speaking of the tabernacle built by Moses in the wilderness. He sees this place then as a place that we can all come to worship God. Indeed, he believed that there was the end of the journey. They could build a booth, a tabernacle, like the one in the Old Testament that we know so well of, so that all of Israel could come to the mountaintop and there worship God and worship Christ and worship Moses and Elijah. Peter must have believed that everything that they had seen and heard and experienced was leading up to this very moment. This was the ultimate experience. They had reached the end of their journey. This is where the payoff was. This is what it was all going to be about. Peter, like so many others, had either forgotten about Jesus' prediction of his coming, suffering, and death, or just plainly didn't understand it. Peter wanted to stop everything at this very highlight of his spiritual life, and there to live in the hope of preserving that moment forever. And seriously, who could blame Peter in that moment? I dare say that we would feel the same way. But all of that was laid to rest. As we know, this great and glorious event was just the beginning. And what was just ahead was the greater glory of his death and resurrection. Now, in his defense again, Peter could never have fully imagined the splendor of what he was witnessing, and so was overwhelmed in the moment. I doubt that any of us would have remembered anything Jesus had told us prior to witnessing those amazing things on the mountaintop. And so, what you might ask, I guess, does this have to do with us? Why do we share this story? Why do we look at it again and again and again here at the beginning of Lent? Well, friends, it has plenty to do with us. We have come here today to worship God from many walks of life. And though we have a great deal in common, all of us gathered here today, we all have different stories when we talk of the faith journey that has brought us to where we are today. Most of us have had those wonderful mountaintop experiences where we felt ourselves to be so close to God, or where we felt for the first time that feeling of being truly loved by God, to be truly felt like we were loved by Jesus Christ, to be in that community where we felt truly loved by the people of God. If you haven't felt it, I pray that one day you will. But if you have, you can remember what it was like in that moment. We all want to stay there. We all want to maintain that moment. We all want to have that feeling that goes on forever and ever and ever. All the pain is gone. All the hardship is gone. All the sadness is gone. And we are in that moment of pure bliss. Who wouldn't want it to continue? Perhaps it was for you that moment when you stood alone in the woods, or in the midst of a huge crowd, and your eyes were finally open to what faith in Jesus was really all about. Perhaps it's when you found yourself touched by an angel, or witnessed a miracle. Or perhaps it was only a moment in which you found yourself caught up in emotions that you could no longer control, and found that you didn't want it to end. Whatever or wherever your mountaintop experience occurred, it was surely a moment you didn't want to end. And so, like Peter, you reached the pinnacle of your spiritual life, and you wanted to stay there. You wanted to live there forever. But you know, we can never stay up there on the mountain. You always have to come down. As much as we would like to stay, we cannot live on the mountaintop. We try to bring the mountaintop down with us into the valley, but reality never quite lets us do that. And so we long to experience it again and again and again. This is what Peter and the others must have felt. Imagine that moment of feeling lost. That terrible desire to return to the mountaintop over and over again, to recapture that mountaintop experience, especially in those dark days after the crucifixion. But longing for the good old days isn't the life that any of us were called to pursue. And so we must now follow the example of Christ and descend from the mountaintops into the dark valleys of the world around us. We must return to this world in which we live day by day, just as Christ did, descending into some of the darkest valleys of our lives. Christ did so looking ahead to the cross, knowing that the path through the dark valley of suffering and death was the path that led him to his greatest glory, his highest mountaintop, the resurrection. And so we too must be feeling and willing to suffer through hardships in our own service to God. But in doing so, we do it with the faith that we too are only moving on to greater glory, toward higher mountaintop experiences in our life. and beyond. In this story, we should, each one of us, find comfort and find hope. That when we look at it through the eyes of the cross, we find it easier to see the dark valleys in our lives as the springboards to higher mountaintops. And yet, friends, it is still more than that. For we find here in this story, in Jesus' descent from the mountain, our own call to service. The transfiguration was for Christ only a brief stop on his journey to the cross. It was, in a sense, that bend in the road that signified the beginning of his stretch for home. Jesus understood what Peter could not, that it wasn't the end on the mountaintop. It was just another step on the greater journey. The event of the Transfiguration puts Jesus in line with the story that had begun in the Old Testament. The salvation story that began in the Garden of Eden, which took its own turns with the life of Moses and then again in the life of Elijah. It was now taking a new turn in the life of Jesus and of Peter and James and John, and indeed all of us. Because Jesus was moving the story to a new level, a new place, moving salvation history toward its climax, his death and resurrection. And yet that climax, his death and resurrection, was still not the end. For just as the Bible does not end with Easter, neither does salvation history. By claiming our faith in Jesus Christ, we can now step in line with that same story. We become part of salvation history with Moses and Elijah. And though we're not likely to achieve the same success, nor be burdened with the same task, we share that same calling to serve the purpose of God. Imagine for a moment what happened in the life of Peter, James, and John. Imagine how many people they touched in their ministry, how many people they introduced to the person of Jesus Christ. Imagine how many people they influenced along the way. And if you have trouble imagining it, friends, understand that you are here because of what they did. And now think for a moment about your own mountaintop experiences. Yes, you wanted to stay there. We all do. I myself dream of returning to those places. But we can't stay there. Because the real ministry is down the mountain in the valleys. Where we who have experienced the mountaintop, where we who have experienced that life, that moment, that feeling of being in the presence of God, must now go down the mountain and share that experience so that others might seek to go up the mountain themselves. Imagine how many people in your life you have already touched. Your friends, your family, your children. I think back on the life and those moments of mountaintop experiences, that first experience when I truly felt I was in the presence of God and I thought it couldn't get any better. And yet I had to go down the mountain, which in truth for me was not coming down the mountain. It was ascending up the valley from that camp that I still go to. My mountaintop experience was in a beautiful little valley. But for me, I understood that the real ministry was not there in that camp. The real ministry was up out of the valley, back into the world. And there I began to understand what it meant to do ministry, to touch people's lives. And that led me to even higher mountaintops. Moments when I experienced the miraculous presence of Christ. Moments when I experienced and witnessed miraculous things. Friends, we as the disciples did, must now follow Jesus down into the valley, toward the cross and beyond. The ministry God intends for each and every one of us, friends, is out there, beyond these doors, in the valley filled with the darkness of this world. Because out there, right now, are wandering around people who are lost and hurt and confused, searching for shelter from the storms of this life. Out there, they are thirsting for the water offered by Jesus, the water that we have been called to carry to them. Out there are people, dare I say, who are in need of an oasis of hope in Jesus Christ. An oasis in the midst of a wilderness. But are we the ones who will invite them in and show them the hospitality of God? Or will we go through the wilderness, playing it safe and keeping it to ourselves? Though Jesus told Peter and James and John to keep quiet about what they saw, that time of secrecy, friends, ended 2,000 years ago. Now is the time to go with Jesus down the mountain where the real ministry remains. Now is the time for us to travel beyond those doors into the wilderness where the real ministry remains. Now is the time to pick up the mantle of Jesus and of Peter and James and John and all the others who in their part of salvation history brought you to this place. Now is the time to understand that you are being called to go out into that darkness, out into that wilderness, and lead others into what you have discovered about God and about Jesus Christ, so that they are no longer lost, but they know what we know. Now is the time to understand that the real ministry is not what we've done, but what lies ahead. Because in doing that ministry before you, you follow Christ to the greater glory which is still yet to come. Because even if you think you've accomplished what you need to do, the good news, friends, is if you're still breathing, there's still more ministry ahead and still more glory for you to see. Amen.